Hello and welcome to our podcast Pager. I'm George Milner.
And I'm Stan Dale.
Tune in to hear us talk with some amazing people about the subjects changing medicine today. In this short series, we speak to the editors-in-chief of three of the world's top scientific journals: the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, and Nature. A broad theme running throughout is what are the roles and responsibilities of journals in the 21st century. First up, we speak with Dr. Richard Horton, who has been editor-in-chief of the Lancet since 1995. We talk about how journals maintain scientific rigour, particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic, what makes a good editor, how political should medical journals be, and their wider role in making sure that the evidence that they publish is not only heard, but also acted upon. Enjoy the episode, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Richard, thanks for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you with me.
Great to be with you.
So, first thing I'd like to start with is, what exactly is the role of an editor-in-chief? What do you spend most of your time doing?
Well, at the moment, I spend my time, 100% of my time, pretty much on COVID-19. That's not my usual day job. My usual day job is to read research papers that are submitted, to critically appraise them, to see whether they might be suitable for publication in the journal, and also to write and to think a little bit about medicine and what it is today, and reflect on the state of healthcare, not just in the United Kingdom, but around the world. So it's a pretty diverse job, but at the moment it doesn't feel very diverse.
What do you think makes a good editor then? You've been in this position for 25 years.
Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, I think that the two qualities that I would say are important are, first of all, a relentless curiosity about medical science. I loved science when I was at school. I loved science when I was doing my medical degree, and I still love science. So it's always exciting to open the envelope, not that we have envelopes anymore, but to open the envelope of a new research paper and to read what scientists have actually done. So curiosity, number one. But number two, and equally important, is to retain the capacities to still be shocked by the injustices that you see in health and welfare around the world. Never to become immune to those injustices, because the Lancet is not just about publishing great science. The Lancet is also about trying to use that science as a platform for political advocacy and to make a political case for taking health and healthcare more seriously.
And do you think that's an easy thing to happen to people when they go into maybe a prestigious journal like the Lancet, and actually suddenly the ideals that you came in with are subject to a bit of a pounding by reality, and then they slightly fade away?
I don't think that. I think that, yes, you do start off with a set of values which become shaped by your experiences first at medical school. And of course, I can only speak for myself. But for me, those values or those experiences brought into even sharper distinction the importance of the political dimension of health. Just to give you an example, if you think about the great progress that was made in public health in the 19th century, that progress didn't come about because of papers published in the Lancet. That progress came about because people were engaged in a political struggle. The science behind that political struggle was very important in understanding the nature of disease and the causes of disease. But ultimately, in order to translate that research into progress for society, one needed to get political. And I think those two features of the Lancet remain very important. Publish great science, yes, but also make sure that that science does some serious work if it's going to really translate into practice and policy.
You're a great believer that health issues are political issues. And to this extent, how political should a journal be then? And I'm using the word political quite loosely here.
Yes, not party political. I don't think we should ever say vote X or vote Y. But I do think we need to be saying constantly that science and medicine are political issues. So, for example, with the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, if we see that the NHS is struggling, as it certainly has been challenged during this COVID-19 situation, then it's our job to try and hold politicians accountable for what they've done or not done in protecting health workers and protecting the public. That is definitely the role of a medical journal, and it is explicitly political.
So how do you achieve that goal then? I see the journal's role to be in two parts. There's the publishing of papers and also the interpretation of those papers and editorials, opinion pieces.
No, that's right. I mean, if we take the COVID-19 situation, we've published a lot of work over the last 2 to 3 months, which gives clues about the nature of the disease, clues about the extent of lockdown that we might require, and clues about how we get out of that lockdown. Now, I think that we could just publish those papers and leave them on a website or a library shelf and let other people read them. But that is not our role, or not only our role. Our role also has to be to take that work and to try and interpret it in the public sphere. So what is the experience from China, and how does that experience influence our decision making in the UK? What is the experience in Italy, and how does that influence what we're doing here? And then engaging in those political discussions. They are political discussions, they're not merely scientific discussions. Every day at the press conferences that you see here in 10 Downing Street, there's always a politician standing next to a scientist or a physician. And that mirrors exactly the situation that we're talking about. There is a scientist who's presenting the data and a politician who's putting it into a political context. And our task is to speak to both of those domains, the scientific and the political.
And moving on from this, how do you ensure that actually the scientific information is not only heard, but also acted upon in terms of policy? Because there's a distinction here.
Well, that's a really tough challenge. I mean, you're absolutely right. Making sure that the work we publish is read and understood and acted upon. We are not in full control of that process. But what we can do is try and amplify the work that we publish by going out and making sure that we communicate with the public, with the media, and sometimes getting directly in touch with politicians to try and support their decision making.
And are you aware of appealing to different audiences in this case? There's obviously a core group of readers with a lot of medical expertise as well, and then there's this wider audience that might not even have a medical background. Can you cater to everybody at once or via different channels?
I think thanks to social media and the news media, we can cater to different audiences. So the work we publish, we are not publishing for a general audience, but thanks to reporters on national newspapers or national television, and not just in this country, but around the world, the work gets interpreted and filtered for that broader audience. And that is extremely valuable to try and get this work out to try and make a difference. If I think back 25 years ago, I don't think that the work we published was as broadly read. But today, I think it is. And that's thanks to the internet, and it's thanks to social media.
And are you worried, on the flip side, about misinterpretation of the work that you publish? Because the Lancet, it's a global brand, it's a very prestigious brand, and it can often be put, despite its best intentions, within a paper. It can often be attached to comments on that paper or interpretations of it that actually might be completely misunderstood. And indeed, I saw about a week ago the Sunday Times article that came out. You were quite aggrieved to be quoted in out of context. In the government's response to that.
Yeah, that definitely happens. And you can't, I don't complain about that, in the sense that if you're going to go out and take a message into the public sphere, then you're going to be engaged in a conversation which can rapidly become a debate, which can rapidly become an acrimonious exchange. So it's inevitable in some ways that these disagreements take place, but that's okay. I would rather I would rather somebody reacted negatively to something I said or we said than they didn't react at all because we weren't part of the conversation. I see my role, and I see the Lancet's role, as trying to project the evidence, science, into a national conversation or a global conversation. My task is it doesn't matter what I personally think about a particular issue, but what I'm trying to do is to take the evidence that we publish and make sure that that evidence is heard. That does matter, and that's my role. I see my role as a conduit, somebody who's trying to mediate between the scientist and the public or the policymaker.
And should there perhaps be a role beyond just communication of the evidence? Because we've seen failings of just communicating evidence in public health around the world. Is there room for journals taking actually a slightly more what we'd call political stance on an issue, because they feel if they don't take that, then actually there won't be as clear a message?
Well, I would like to see more medical journal. Not every single medical journal or scientific journal can be political. If I'm the editor of the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, there will be certain dimensions of orthopedics which may be political, but most of the time it will not be. So it depends upon the journal. But for a journal that says that it's a general medical journal, and certainly with the history that the Lancet has, then definitely we need to be political. I very much disagree with those, and there are those who believe this sincerely, but I do very much disagree with the view that medicine is not political. Medicine is political. It's always been political, and it will continue to be political. One can't ignore that. One needs to embrace it and get stuck into the debate.
How do you deal with the fact that the politics around things change and the evidence base changes? Some political messages that can be put out there and some opinions on things can look horrifically outdated, even 6 months later.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think the message, all I can say there is one does the best that one can do in trying to take the best available evidence and project it into the public debate. A good example is diet. If I think back over 20, 25 years, the messages about diet have changed, if not every year, then subtle differences every few years. So we can only take the state of knowledge that we have at a particular time and do the best we can with that knowledge. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean to say that one shouldn't do it. If we took that view, then we probably wouldn't have made any progress in society at all, because to a degree, science is always about uncertainty. Science is always about doubt. And as doctors, what we know is that we have to make decisions for patient care and for public health in the face of uncertainty and in the face of doubt. One can't stand on the sidelines with a patient who's exsanguinating in front of you and say, well, I'm not quite sure what the randomized trial evidence is for doing a particular procedure. The fact is, you have to act under conditions of uncertainty. And that's the case with public policy as well.
And I guess in this case, uncertainty doesn't mean no information at all. There can still be precedents, there can still be trials that perhaps aren't at the gold standard that we'd like them to be.
Yes, and that's a very interesting issue currently with the COVID-19 situation. We're getting papers submitted to us, for example, about the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine following President Trump's interventions on multiple occasions and others. And the question for us is, what level of quality of evidence does there need to be before the Lancet published a paper saying that hydroxychloroquine is safe or not safe, effective or not effective? Do we need to wait for a randomized trial in 50,000 people so that we are absolutely certain about the result? Or, given that this is a very urgent, pressing question, should we lower the threshold of quality to make sure that there's some evidence out there? And we are having those debates, if not on a daily basis, then certainly every other daily basis.
And I guess it's a case of clinical quality here. We've seen the same thing with the flagship first paper on remdesivir published in the New England Journal, which was a long way from gold standard. It didn't have a control arm, lost lots of patients to follow up, seemed to be randomly cherry-picking people from around the world. But where do you think the balance lies then in terms of that evidence base?
I fully agree. I saw that paper, and my sympathies genuinely went out to the editors at the New England Journal, because we are seeing papers exactly similar to that, both for remdesivir and for other drugs that have been proposed. And we are struggling with knowing whether we go with a paper or whether we don't, based upon quality, but also based upon the fast-moving nature of this pandemic. And I think for us, we have got some principles here that we're trying to apply. So for a paper that is going to claim efficacy, we would definitely require a randomized trial. For a paper that's going to raise issues of safety, we would be comfortable with a paper that would be based on more observational epidemiological evidence. I think that's probably a prudent way to go. We would never base efficacy on a paper that didn't have some sort of randomization or control. But I think for finding a safety signal about a drug, then an observational approach it can be appropriate.
On the other hand, do you think actually in these situations, as long as a paper is clear on what it is, it's clear that it's, for example, an exploratory trial, or it's one looking at safety, or it's just saying, listen, we should maybe look into this a bit more, that actually it's okay to publish things, as long as they are clear on what exactly they should be used for and what they shouldn't be used for, even if it's a lower quality of evidence?
No, I don't think that's good enough. I think the difficulty for journals like the Lancet and the New England Journal is that because their names are so well known, if the Lancet publishes a paper that says, well, possibly drug A might work in certain circumstances, but we'll have to wait and see for better evidence to come. The way that it will be interpreted is the Lancet has published a paper saying that A could work in this disease. And because it's the Lancet that's published it, it will get much more attention. So I think one lesson I've learned over 20 years is that we actually have to be very careful not to confuse decision makers, whether they be clinicians or policy makers, by publishing evidence that's too early. I would love to be able to publish more speculative work because it's important and interesting, but I'm very conscious of the fact that doing that can occasionally cause damage and can be dangerous. So I think we have it's a very difficult balance.
This seems to come down to the idea that actually, in a perfect world, everybody would properly critically appraise all the evidence in front of them for their decision making, but actually even good clinicians might not necessarily have the time to go through things, or might have the decisions swayed when they, particularly at a time like this, when they otherwise wouldn't.
No, absolutely. And if you're a clinician on the front line, I don't want you spending your time reading the Lancet. I want you spending your time, when you have to be with patients, you're with patients, and the rest of the time, rest. Clinicians do their job on the front line, we do our job, but we have to be very careful about the information that goes out there with the Lancet label attached to it. So I would say that we try and take a precautionary approach to the way we publish, at the same time as what we talked about before, which is making sure that we have a serious political debate about the meaning of that evidence.
Another challenge in the COVID-19 pandemic is just the speed at which everything is coming out and the speed with which people want information on the front line. So my question here is, how do you combine speed and also rigour in terms of peer review and going through these papers and making sure that they are appropriate for the Lancet, and also looking at things like conflict of interest?
Well, we're very lucky that we have a team of absolutely fabulous editors who work at the Lancet. And they are a mixture of medically qualified editors and PhD trained editors. So they have fantastic critical appraisal skills themselves. We are also very lucky because when we have an interesting and potentially important paper and we ask peer reviewers to look at it, they are genuinely enthusiastic about doing that work very, very quickly. So we can turn around papers in peer review within 24 to 48 hours, and we can then edit those papers and get them online again within 48 hours as well. So we can take a paper from receipt to publication in an emergency in a matter of days and still be able to keep the level of rigor and quality assurance that we need to for that science. So we're in a very privileged position, I'm aware, in having both those editors and peer reviewers helping us.
So you think it's been entirely maintained? There hasn't been a balance, even to any extent, with doing these processes that normally took maybe weeks or months over a matter of hours?
Well, just as in the health service, we've seen that there are patients who may have other conditions such as heart disease or cancer or anything. They've been slightly displaced from the capacity of the NHS because the focus of the NHS has been on managing the peak of this epidemic. So as Chris Whitty always talks about, we need to be looking at indirect mortality as well as direct mortality from COVID-19. Well, a similar situation has happened at the Lancet, in that we have directed our attention, just because of the sheer volume of research that's been submitted to us, we've directed our attention to COVID-19, and we have had to have relatively less attention paid to other domains of medicine during the past 2 months or so. So there is a cost. We have turned our attention away from those broader domains of medicine for the time being and focused very explicitly on this pandemic. And then as the pandemic first wave begins to ebb away, we will return to this broader focus. But it is certainly true that in order to cope with this wave of papers, we've had to make choices. We've had to prioritize.
But just focusing on COVID here, would you say it's exactly the same, the standards that have been applied to COVID papers over 48 hours compared to it's a hard comparison to make compared to the papers that were published several months ago on other topics?
Oh, definitely. In fact, I would say that they've been scrutinized down to the very, very last word in the paper. You know, I've been reading papers in the pre-publication phase and querying with authors whether we should say particular words, because could those words be misunderstood or misinterpreted in the way that they have been written. So I would say that we've been super, super careful about the work that we've been publishing, because if we get it wrong in the middle of a pandemic, that could be extremely dangerous.
And is this something that more broadly you apply to papers that perhaps have would have the greatest public spotlight on them and the greatest room for misinterpretation? Are the ones that you're most careful about editing and publishing?
That's another lesson we've definitely learned at the Lancet over 25 years, and that is that when you have a paper that seems to be making an extraordinary claim or could be read in an extraordinary way, then we need to apply extraordinary levels of care and attention through extra peer review and taking an even more precautionary approach. So the answer to your question is yes, we need to be very, very careful about those sorts of papers. They don't come along very often. Perhaps once a year you'll have a paper that will have the potential to be harmful if it's wrong, but it's still important to pursue it. So yes, that's a very hard lesson to learn, but it's an important lesson for every editor to learn.
And what about, in this case, giving weight to the information that's come before and the papers that have come before? Because I'm thinking of an example where a paper could come out that disagrees with the entire literature before, but by being published right now in a prestigious medical journal, that is the focus for the media around it. It forgets all of the other evidence, because you have to give some balance to actually the scientific context in which a paper is published in, particularly if it disagrees with it.
No, that's true. I mean, the way we always try and think about it is that a paper is not an event in itself. A paper is part of a process over time. So when a paper is published, that paper in the discussion should try and take account of not just the work that's being presented in the paper, but it should be discussed in the context of the totality of available evidence. And only when you discuss a paper and understand a paper in the context of the totality of available evidence can you really understand what that paper is telling you. So context is very important, and we always have at the beginning of every paper a little panel which tries to put that evidence in context, because without that, a paper can be very easily misunderstood.
And another question coming on from this is, to what extent do you trust the contents of papers by default when you're considering them for publication? Do you have any processes for verifying methods and things like that, particularly now given the pace of change and actually quite a few incentives involved in publishing amidst a pandemic?
Well, you raise a very interesting question, because I think this is sometimes a misconception about what journals do. A journal can never validate a research paper. Validation requires somebody to go out and try and repeat the experiment, whatever the research is. That's validation. We don't do that. What we are doing is we're trying to read and understand the paper, and then ask a sample of reviewers what they think and whether they can understand and whether they feel that the research claims in the paper are backed up by the methods and findings. So what we're doing is testing something different from validity. We are testing acceptability. Is this work acceptable within a certain number of degrees of freedom defined by the editors and the peer reviewers? And then what our task is to negotiate the claims that are made in a paper within those bounds of uncertainty. So it's never about saying if a paper's published in the Lancet, that does not mean that it's true. It means that to the best of our ability, we believe these results are acceptable enough, reliable enough to be presented to a readership, for them to understand themselves. So that is maybe a subtle, but nevertheless very, very important distinction. We can never say that we're publishing the truth. We are saying that we're publishing something, a piece of work that makes a claim within a certain bound of uncertainty, which is something very different from saying we're publishing the truth. And not everybody always. It's true that I think sometimes the media and the public and even members of our own profession don't always fully understand that distinction.
It seems like quite an important one, because you can only deal with what has been presented in front of you. You can't see what hasn't been written. So are there any processes here by which certain things that you look for to imply that actually this has a decent scientific backing to it and we're not missing anything?
You know, one of the problems with the whole publication process, I mean, it's a strength and it's also a potential weakness. The strength is that the whole of science depends upon trust. We're looking for the good in each other. When a paper is submitted to us, we say, we trust you, the researchers, the scientists, the authors, that what you have sent to us is an accurate account of what you've done and a reasonable interpretation of your results. We trust you in what you've done, and they trust us to do a good job of reviewing their paper and hopefully publishing it. But that trust-based system can easily break down if somebody on both sides, both the scientist side and the editorial side, breaches that trust. And that's where we get into problems in journals when there are allegations of research misconduct. And that's where fabrication or falsification can lead to research papers that are actually not telling the truth. And then you get into situations where papers have to be retracted because they've not told the truth. So when the trust-based system works, it's a great system. When it breaks down, then you have a disaster.
If you do end up rejecting a paper, do you share any reasons with other organisations who might be approached to publish it later on? Is there any sort of communication between the Lancet and other journals?
Well, of course, we don't know where if we do let a paper go, we don't know where the authors have sent that paper. If we have got peer reviews on the paper, then the authors will have those, and hopefully they will revise their paper when they submit it to another journal so that it's a better paper. But we obviously don't know that. And that is one of the inefficiencies in the system. One of the inefficiencies is indeed that papers get sent to different journals in sequence, and if a paper gets bounced from one journal to another journal to another journal, then that's not a satisfactory process for authors. The only thing I would say there is that there are now literally thousands of medical journals out there, and as somebody once said, actually many years ago, the only thing stopping you from getting your paper published is the lack of a stamp in the days when we used to post things. It's almost certain you'll get your paper published somewhere. It might not be in the Lancet or the New England Journal of Medicine, but it's likely to be somewhere. And it's just judging where is the best home for your work. And a lot of the time, that's what we're doing. We're giving advice to authors about where is the best place for your work.